But in my judgment, I think it's hugely important for us to know more about it. And there are three reasons which I just note at the bottom of your handout. I think that when the interfaith dialogue world and industry thinks about the future, we've got to stop hoping that the way forward is going to be sort of secular humanism, which denies the truths of religion, or even that we're going to have lots of liberal Christians who are skeptical about the particularities of their traditions. That's just not where the world's going. I mean, I think it's quite interesting that secularization thesis has manifestly failed. I mean, the confidence of the 60s and the 70s that with modernity comes decreasing religious participation and identification, that isn't true. I mean, Europe's the exception rather than the rule. America remains counter to that, but also as modernity takes off in places like India and in China and elsewhere, actually you find that religious propensities are running parallel with some of the growth in these areas. So we've got to live with the truth that religion in its particular forms are with us forever. We're not going to move to a situation where religion is losing its power or effectiveness over people's lives. And we've got to work with the fact that people want to, if they're going to identify with a religious tradition, actually want to identify with it. In other words, if you're Christian, most Christians want to continue to believe in the Incarnation and the Trinity. If you're a Muslim, most Muslims want to believe in the infallibility of the Quran. If you're a Jew, most Jews want to believe that in some sense the Torah comes from God. If you are, in fact, these forms of religion are where people in the end identify and grow into and learn what it is to be religious from. So the reason why I think Saeed Nursi is so fascinating is because he is, to use Alistair MacIntyre's phrase, a good example of a tradition-constituted theologian. In other words, he knows he's located, and he spends his time illustrating that out of that place of rootedness and location, he's got to illustrate that what the Quran and what the Hadith is teaching is a deep commitment to pluralism, coexistence with difference, dialogue, learning from the best of other traditions, building alliances, while at the same time believing that ultimately Christians are mistaken. And as a Christian, I have no problem with that. But I think that's quite a good place for a Muslim to be. I mean, I don't mind Muslims disagreeing with me about the Trinity and the Incarnation, that's fine. But I am eager to work with them when we can, to build alliances, to have conversations, to commit to peace, work together, to commit to building and constructing a better world, and to work together in the task of advocating for faith. So it's a good, and in my view, what you have methodologically in Benjusim and Saeed Nursi is a good model. I mean, what Christians need their own Benjusim and Saeed Nursi, somebody who's equally rooted, equally committed to the truths of Christianity, who can therefore speak to those in our own tradition which have problems with religious diversity and pluralism, and illustrate that there are good Christian reasons for constructive relationships with the diversity of God's providential gift of diversity. Hinduism needs it. Buddhism needs it. I mean, all these traditions need people who are clearly belonging and at the same time illustrate that out of that place of belonging, there are good reasons to coexist with difference and diversity. I'm going to pause there and turn back to Carol and just invite any questions or discussion.
Thank you very much. Just observing you talking about Nursi, you have a lot of enthusiasm and energy and passion. So, and not having met the man, but you've experienced him through his writings. My question for you, which I sort of posed earlier, is this sounds like he's a person that, as you say, every tradition needs a Nursi. But how can other traditions, non-Muslim traditions, discover Nursi in order to apply those principles of finding that person who can bridge the modernity and the religious traditions? So do you have any ideas of how we can bring Nursi to Christians and to Jews?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm very interested in the sociology of ideas and how ideas catch on and how certain groups become famous and how certain individuals get attention. And I have a sort of suspicion that actually that's quite haphazard. I don't know whether history is always fair to those who deserve attention. I'm sure the present is hardly ever fair to people who deserve attention. And I think history often doesn't quite get it right. And therefore, libraries are special and precious places. I'm deeply committed to the whole phenomenon of the library and what it actually does for protecting those. The most important books in the library are actually those which are never taken out. Because that makes sure that those volumes are there for somebody to discover in 20, 30 years' time. And of course, there is something always very interesting. I mean, David Hume, for example, in philosophy was, I suppose, his bestseller was The History of England, an odd book written by a Scotsman. And he made his living throughout his entire professional life as a librarian. And it was actually only thanks to Immanuel Kant that actually he ever really got his status in the history of ideas. So there is something very interesting about that. Now, when it comes to Islam, I think we all have an obligation to be very, very careful, because I think the people who are doing most to disseminate Western perceptions of Islam are those who are least sympathetic to peace and constructive relationships with Muslims. So Wahhabi Islam's getting tons of attention. Osama bin Laden's getting tons of attention. The Egyptian Brotherhood's getting lots of attention. Lots of books being written about Al-Qaeda. And I think we do need to say, look, hang on, let's just be a little fair here and do the exercise of really seeking to understand what's going on inside the Muslim world. We need to actually read more widely. So to put it bluntly, I think a factor in the neglect of Benjusim and Said Nursi is Islamophobia. We're not working hard enough to find out, who's shaping the lives of many Muslims living around the world today. Another factor is just sociologically. His writings were discouraged, to say the least, by the government of Turkey. Printed editions only appeared, you can probably give me the precise dates, but in the last 30 years or so, 1950s. Translations came slower. It's taken some time for this to get, still in English. Studies on Benjusim and Said Nursi are relatively few. 5 or 6 collections of essays now. But here you have an inspiration to literally millions. 9 million's up there. That's bigger than the Episcopal Church by several times over. It's a significant movement inside Islam, and it's deeply committed to non-violence and dialogue. And I think that, if you take anything away from this presentation, next time somebody says, where are the moderate Muslim voices, or why don't I hear Muslims condemn more often non-violence, you can just say, look, they say these things all the time, and you're just not listening. But B, did you know, for example, one of the largest Muslim movements in the world is inspired by a non-violent, dialogical Muslim? And that doesn't mean that he doesn't believe anything about Islam either. It's not just a Western Muslim who's long since spends all his time in the bar and drinking, and this is coming out of a real place. So I think, that is an interesting question, and I think the answer, in short, is partly the way the movement has finally got some space to draw attention to Nursi, partly the translation of his writings, partly the slowness of the academy to take an interest in non-Middle Eastern forms of Islam. And partly we just find learning about terrorists much more interesting, and we're not paying attention to the billion Muslims. We're still fixated on the minority.
You're in a position as the dean and president of a seminary to be able to incorporate some of this awareness of Nursi with the the next generation of preachers and teachers in the Episcopal Church